Emmanuel Haro vanished under suspicious circumstances, and the immediate reaction was shock and confusion. People want a neat, simple explanation for something so painful. A stranger swoops in, takes a child, everyone pours energy into the search, and if we're lucky, there's a quick resolution. That's not what happened here. From the start, the circumstances around Emmanuel's disappearance looked incomplete and contradictory. The call to authorities came with urgent fear, but the physical evidence, the eyewitness reports, and the surveillance material investigators later gathered did not produce the clear trail people expect in a public abduction. No vehicle was immediately linked to a suspect, no credible third-party witness stepped forward at once, and the scene that should have been chaotic, a parking lot in broad daylight, did not show the obvious signs of a hurried grabbing and escape. Those gaps in the obvious narrative made people look at other possibilities. What if this wasn't a brief, opportunistic crime at all? What if the key pieces of the story were inside the home, not outside it? When a child disappears, investigators start by looking close to home. Statistically, the majority of harm to young children occurs at the hands of someone they know. That hard fact is why missing child probes quickly include interviews with relatives, checks of household history, and scrutiny of family dynamics. In Emmanuel's case, the early public record includes both a desperate call for help and questions about why standard responses, an Amber Alert, large coordinated searches based on suspect descriptions, were not immediately triggered or did not lead to a quick recovery. Those procedural questions raised suspicion for some observers and led investigators to dig deeper into the family background, prior contacts with child protective services, and any criminal records. In other words, the absence of the usual abduction trail forced a shift in how both officials and the public thought about the case. Instead of a stranger, attention moved toward the people who had the most access to Emmanuel. That transition in focus is not a leap to judgment. It's a reallocation of investigative energy driven by the facts at hand. When simple explanations collapse under scrutiny, detectives widen the frame. It's also why community members who had once dismissed subtle concerns about the household began to re-examine what they'd noticed over time. Small, previously overlooked details, a parent's volatile temper, frequent late-night visitors, or a child who seemed unusually withdrawn, become important data points. Those pieces, taken together, make the picture less random and more centered on the family itself. The real pain of a case like this is that those earlier warnings sometimes feel obvious only after the worst has already happened. Investigators must follow evidence, not rumor. But evidence here pushed them to consider whether Emmanuel's disappearance was the result of an external predator, an orchestrated cover-up, or actions by someone inside the family circle. Each path requires a different kind of proof. Vehicle traces and eyewitnesses for a stranger abduction, digital footprints, communications, and staged movements for a planned disappearance, and forensic and domestic history evidence to implicate those living in the same house. The lack of immediate external clues made the latter possibilities harder to ignore and harder to rule out, which is why the investigation grew more complex and why the public's questions hardened into suspicion. People who hoped this would be a simple rescue were forced to accept a more complicated and darker reality, a reality where ignored warnings and family dynamics might be central to the answer. Rebecca, Emmanuel's mother, had warned others about Jake's temper and secrecy before the disappearance, and those warnings now matter in a new light. Neighbors, friends, and a handful of public statements say Rebecca had at times described uncomfortable episodes. A partner who lost his temper quickly, private behavior that made her uneasy, and a general sense that some things in the household were being kept hidden. When someone close to a caregiver raises repeated concerns about temperament and secrecy, investigators pay attention. Such reports are not proof of guilt. They are pointers to a pattern that warrants verification. In missing child inquiries, pre-disappearance statements can be among the most valuable pieces of context investigators can use to reconstruct motive, opportunity, and risk. The human side of those warnings is important. People tend to give context to others they know. A neighbor might remember a late-night argument that seemed like nothing at the time, or a friend might recall a flinch when a car door slammed. These small recollections can coalesce into a pattern that only becomes apparent when viewed against a later tragedy. When Rebecca voiced alarm, it should have been cataloged, checked, and cross-referenced with any formal records such as prior police calls or social services notes. Investigators routinely do that work. They check phone logs, prior complaints, and any welfare visits. That process is necessary because repeated verbal warnings, especially when voiced by a caregiver who has daily responsibility for a child, are a red flag that must be evaluated, not dismissed as private drama. But there are practical obstacles to acting on such warnings. Social ties, fear of intruding, and assumptions that family problems should remain private often prevent early intervention. People who hear an offhand caution about someone's temper may rationalize it as stress, economic pressure, or a specific bad day. That reluctance to escalate concern to authorities is an unfortunate feature of many tragedies. In Emmanuel's case, those early voices of concern now read differently. What sounded like domestic strain may have been a warning bell. The investigator's job is to translate those human impressions into verifiable leads, to see whether repeated alarms correspond to objective records or other witnesses who can confirm patterns of behavior. That verification process takes time and sensitivity. Victim advocates warn that broad public accusations can re-traumatize survivors and complicate investigations. Still, when a parent raises concerns about another adult's temper around children, it's incumbent on family, friends, and professionals to check that observation. In this investigation, Rebecca's early warnings are one of the threads detectives have used to build their timeline and to decide where to direct resources. Whether those warnings will become the basis of legal action or remain context for investigators depends on corroborating physical and digital evidence. For now, they are part of a record that suggests the disappearance may not have been as random as it first appeared. Rebecca's sudden silence after the initial outcry is complex and telling in its ambiguity. Immediately after the disappearance, she appeared publicly distraught, pleading for help, for leads, for anyone who might have seen her baby. Those public pleas are a raw and human element of the case. But then her voice receded. She limited public interviews and later issued statements that were less detailed than her initial account. That change has been interpreted in different ways, and it's important to consider the possible explanations carefully and fairly. Law enforcement's investigative steps were broad and serious, but they so far yielded no trace of Emmanuel. Authorities executed warrants, searched the family home, seized a vehicle for forensic testing, and used K-9 teams and aerial resources to comb nearby fields and drainage areas. These actions are standard in a case with red flags. Vehicle seizures can reveal trace DNA, fibers, or signs of movement. Home searches can uncover evidence hidden or discarded. Cadaver dogs can detect decomposing remains or parts. Aerial searches and K-9 sweeps extend the effective search radius quickly. That exhaustive approach reflects the gravity of a missing infant and the need to consider all possibilities. Despite those efforts, investigators did not find physical evidence that proved a stranger had taken Emmanuel or that immediately identified a crime scene. That gap is why investigators considered other theories rather than focusing solely on external abduction. When intensive searches of the scene and nearby areas produce nothing, detectives must widen their methods. Digital forensics, cell phone data, doorbell and business camera footage, and interviews with anyone who might have had contact with the child in the hours before the disappearance. The absence of a clear external trail makes the internal timeline, who had access and when, a core part of the case. Rebecca later contradicted aspects of her initial statements, softened her tone, and halted cooperation in ways that complicated the inquiry. Changes in a witness's statement can come from many sources. Trauma can fragment memory, people's recollections evolve, and legal advice can lead to carefully worded public statements meant to avoid self-incrimination. In some cases, a person might change their account because they realize an earlier version was imprecise. In others, changes suggest coaching or coercion. Detectives must untangle these possibilities. They do so by cross-checking physical evidence, analyzing contemporaneous digital records, and seeking independent witnesses whose accounts either confirm or dispute a shifted narrative. The practical effect of a main witness pulling back is that police lose a direct source of information that might otherwise point to quick leads. It increases reliance on indirect evidence that takes longer to obtain and interpret. For the family and the community, it deepens frustration and fuels speculation. For the investigation, it necessitates more warrants, more forensics, and more time, all while the public attention that drives tips and resources can wane. Enhanced photos of Jake circulated online and sparked speculation, though investigators never officially confirmed what those images showed. In the age of social media, images can spread quickly, and people naturally try to read meaning into facial expressions or body language. Enhanced stills or close-ups can look damning or exculpatory, depending on how they are cropped and framed. But images without context are dangerous. Camera angles, lighting, and resolution all influence interpretation. Investigators caution the public that unverified images should not replace careful analysis. Images that go viral often do so because they are emotionally resonant, not because they are conclusive evidence. Social media and the broader media environment amplified rumors and shaped public opinion faster than facts could be verified. In any high-profile case, speculation thrives. People fill gaps with their own narratives, and those narratives can harden into widely held beliefs before investigators publish verified findings. That dynamic is particularly hazardous in cases like this, because online pressure can lead to threats, harassment, false tips, and contamination of evidence. It can also cause organizations to withdraw support if they fear being associated with a potentially misleading narrative. Responsible reporting and sober consumption of information are critical, yet the speed of online sharing often outpaces discipline. Investigators publicly considered three main theories: a stranger abduction, a staged disappearance, or familial involvement. Each theory comes with different investigative expectations. A stranger abduction would likely leave physical traces, witnesses, a vehicle, a path of travel. A staged disappearance might reveal digital or physical signs of planning, unusual communications, or premeditated movement of the child. Familial involvement would likely show discrepancies in timelines, evidence of past harm, and forensic clues within the household or on possessions. In this case, the balance of evidence, the lack of a credible external trail, the family's prior issues, and the inconsistent statements made investigators treat the insider theories as primary areas of focus, while still keeping an open mind to all possibilities. Patterns of behavior and the available evidence pointed more strongly toward those inside Emmanuel's home than to an external stranger. That is not an assertion of guilt. It's an assessment of where the leads most consistently directed investigators based on what they had: prior records, access, timelines that didn't align, and the absence of independent corroboration for the stranger abduction scenario. Investigative prudence means following the strongest leads first, and in this case, those led officers inward. As grim as the detail is, there are clear takeaways. Rebecca's early warnings about a temper and secrecy were not idle chat. They were signals investigators flagged. Jake's silence and legal posture became as significant as any statement might have been. Extensive searches produced no evidence supporting a stranger abduction, and shifting statements and a lack of cooperation made timely resolution much harder. Above all, the case shows how critical it is to take warnings seriously early, to protect vulnerable children proactively, and to resist letting rumor replace methodical police work. The central mystery remains: a mother who warned and then fell quiet, a father whose silence amplified suspicion, and a child whose fate is still unknown. Justice now hinges on breaking the silence, from witnesses, from anyone with information, and from systems that might have missed early opportunities to intervene. If you have verifiable information about the night in question, contact local authorities. A single credible tip can change the course of an investigation.